Welcome back to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios of the National Press Foundation in Washington, D.C. Before we begin our second session of the seventh Widening the Pipeline training, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation, Bayer, Johnson & Johnson, and Twitter. Last month, during the first White House commemoration of Native American Heritage Month, journalists like our next speaker noted the occasion with a mixture of pride and sober contemplation. Acee Agoyo is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Indians.com, an online news portal. And while he enjoyed the celebration, he and other Indigenous journalists experienced the duality of that pride that runs parallel with an awareness of the injustices endured by Native Americans historically. Acee joins us today to talk about that historic White House event and about his career. Welcome, Acee. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to take part in this event with so many young journalists.
Great. Why don't we start by having you tell us a bit about your journalism career and how Indians.com was developed?
Well, believe it or not, Indians.com started in an apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1999. Myself and two other Native people, we had taken a look at what was online at the time regarding Native Americans, and there was basically hardly anything. And we decided, well, it's time that we should just jump into it. Let's start a website that focuses on Native issues, but speaks from a Native perspective, because the information at the time, a lot of it was generated by academics, people who are outside of the community, but obviously they have an interest and a genuine love for the community, but it's different when it comes from people within the community. So myself and two other Native people who were living in Massachusetts at the time, we decided to start the website. And from there, we were able to connect with the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. And the Winnebago tribe owns a corporation that's known as Ho-Chunk Inc. And within several months, basically almost due to luck, we were able to work with them, and we became part of their corporation. So currently, Indians.com, it is independently operated, meaning that we don't have interference from any part of the tribe or any part of the corporation, but we are owned by a tribal corporation. So that in and of itself, it kind of speaks to some of the larger issues that I think some of you heard talked about earlier today with the fight for a tribal free press. But fortunately, we've been lucky to have people who support the need for information to get out to Indian country and the need for it to be independent and to be free from interference.
Tell us about how you find journalists or content for Indians.com. Do you do most of it, or do you have a network of stringers?
Well, we have a very small team. There's three of us, if you can believe it. We started with three and we still have three. So it's myself and Kevin Abaresk, who's our managing editor. He's actually located in Nebraska. And our third person is Todd York, who's located in Oklahoma. So what we do, at least from my part of the job, is since I'm located in Washington, D.C., I cover all the hearings that happen on Capitol Hill. I go to the Supreme Court. Whenever there's a meeting at a federal agency, I go there. And for example, we just had the White House Tribal Nation Summit, so I covered that. And as was mentioned in the opening, we recently had this historic first ever White House Native American Heritage Month celebration.
So you went to MIT, if I recall from your bio. So yeah. How did you shift from that kind of training to journalism?
Well, one of the main reasons that my co-founders and I started the website was we come from technology and educational backgrounds. We saw that the World Wide Web, as it was known back then, it was brand new. You could go to a page and it would list all the websites that were available. And it was a single page. I mean, you could actually go there every day and say, oh, someone started a website and let me look at it. So it was a very different era back in the late 90s. So coming from that perspective, we utilized our educational and technical backgrounds to look at delivering news from that angle, giving the information to people who may not have had it before, giving information to people who might have gotten the news a month late, depending on where they live, because certain parts of Indian country are very rural, so that kind of guided our efforts going forward. And a lot of the things that we focus on involves a lot of research. It involves a lot of understanding technical terms, even legal terms. And so you have to spend a lot of time understanding why Indian law and policy is so complex, complicated, or sometimes it's just outright outrageous. And to do that, we utilize our technical and educational backgrounds to understand Indian law and policy from that perspective.
Of course, we know that these days content is driven often by advertising and who is providing the funding. So I wonder how you have bridged the challenge of that with Indians.com, and are there any unique challenges that you face?
Well, fortunately, being part of a larger corporation, they have a marketing firm and they handle our advertising, and I don't handle any of that. And all I know is that there are people who place ads because they know the site is read by the right audience. People who place job ads because they know they're going to find a candidate who meets their qualified or their qualifications. People who want to place an ad because they know it's going to reach the right people. And as far as I've seen, I haven't come across any conflicts in regard to that. But I don't handle that. We have a marketing firm that handles that.
So I want to follow up on our conversation from yesterday, excuse me, when you talked about how you found out about the White House event, because I think it speaks very much to the challenges that many journalists of color sometimes run into in terms of access to high-level information or opportunities. So why don't you start by simply telling us how you found out about this event?
Yeah, so I mean, as everybody is pretty much aware, November is Native American Heritage Month, and it was declared that, decades ago, I believe, when I was still maybe in high school, it was first declared. So, there's always been federal agencies that have held Native American Heritage Month events, but typically they're in person. But during the pandemic, of course, everything stopped. So basically, 2019 was the last I had ever heard that someone was doing a Native American Heritage Month celebration. So it's understandable that a lot of these events went virtual during the pandemic, but this summer is when people started holding in-person events again on larger scales. People would come to town, but they were smaller events. But this summer, everybody came back. Events were held with hundreds and hundreds of people. So I wasn't surprised that there might be an actual Native American Heritage Month event somewhere. I just didn't know where. Like usually it would be the Department of the Interior. Usually it might be the Department of Health and Human Services. I figured, well, maybe they're going to host something. I wasn't really paying that much attention to it because normally those events, they're nice to attend, but it's not typically something for news. They usually have a nice program. You get to catch up with people. Sometimes you'll get a top level official saying, we acknowledge Native American Heritage Month, and that's kind of the end of it. So I was a bit surprised when I found out a few days before the actual event that there was going to be a celebration at the White House. And the way I found out was not from the White House, it was from invitees. I had a family member tell me, oh, I'm coming to DC. I said, oh, what for? I said, oh, the White House is having a celebration for Native American Heritage Month. And I almost thought he was joking. And so he sent me the actual invite to prove that it was legitimate. And I said, oh, well, who you're coming with? When you guys coming to town? I just was asking a bunch of questions. He said, yeah, we'll be there. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. I'll get to see you, and I'll get to see other people from back home, from New Mexico, which is where I'm from. So I was excited about that. But at this point, I hadn't heard anything from the White House, and I hadn't heard that they were having an event. No one reached out and said, oh, would you like to come? So I just figured, maybe they'll stream it online, which they ended up doing. And it wasn't until Monday, which was the day before the event, that I was actually contacted by the White House, and they asked me to come as media. And I was very happy to do that because, as I had mentioned, during the pandemic, events weren't happening. So I hadn't been to the White House since the Obama era. And that's another issue we could talk about in a different call of why the Trump people didn't want me there, which is an entirely different story.
I
So
kind of
I
think we know. I mean, come on.
yeah, I mean, well, I
Keep
mean,
it real.
yeah, there's obviously a big difference when a new president comes on, and there's obviously a learning curve depending on who's there and the people that the president brings along with them. If they're not interested in Native people, if they're not interested in people of color, if they're not interested in disabled people, if they're not interested in any kind of community that exists out there, they're not going to look for us. They're not going to even bother. And so when you reach out to them, they don't know what to do, which is the opposite experience of what has happened in prior administrations. Even the George W. Bush administration, they were very open because they had people on the team that at least understood and knew that we existed, whereas the Trump people had no clue. There was nothing there. And then when you try to talk to them, you get nothing out of them. I chased two people down once on the steps of the Capitol, and they did not like that at all. So, it is a very different experience when you're dealing with somebody who has knowledge and expertise and who understands where Native people are coming from. And that's why I was kind of surprised when I only heard about this Heritage Month event at the last minute. So, basically learning the day before when you're in DC, and when I'm in DC, since I live here, it's easy for me to say, yeah, of course I'm going to come. But if there are other Native journalists who should have been invited, they need a little bit more heads up because people have to come from out of town. There was a close friend who still does journalism, but he's now independent. He lives in Southern Virginia, so for him it'd be 3 hours drive. So there has to be at least more effort to let Native journalists know because of our sometimes remote locations. So I was a bit surprised to learn so late to be invited to the ceremony in the first place.
Let me ask you to try to paint a picture of what the event was like and how you felt during it. And I asked that question because one of the reasons I wanted to put together this particular session, I was inspired by Pauli Danette Claw's commentary she wrote about the event for Indian Country Today. And she wrote essentially about standing in the halls of this building, this center of democracy, which also doubles as the birthplace of the genocide of Indigenous people or people who were involved in that hundreds of years ago. And so there's this picture of her and Jordan and a few others standing in front of this bust of George Washington. And so it's a beautiful picture and they're all smiling and they all look fabulous. But she noted that sort of duality of being there. So please tell us about how you felt during the day.
Well, for me, the experience was kind of different because I had heard about it from family members and I knew that people from my home were coming. And I also knew that the performers are actually from my village. And one of them is actually a distant relative of mine, and her father was coming along and he lives in our village as well. So for me, I was more kind of excited that the fact that somebody from my community, and we're rather small when you compare us to other tribes, there's only about 3,000 of us. And of those who actually live in our community, there's a much smaller number. So for me to have somebody from my own community perform at the White House and to have been invited to the White House, that was, I was very immensely proud of that. And, seeing them come out, and I was standing in the press area, which was a area to the side. So I was luckily able to get very close to the stage, and seeing them come out and having the ability to see them and acknowledge them, and then for them to wave back, that's a very different experience if I were just covering the event and not seeing somebody that I know and somebody who I'm actually related to. So in that sense, I was really happy about that. But I also wasn't surprised because one of the interesting things or great things about this White House is that there are a lot of New Mexicans who work there. And in the past, there aren't. So the pipeline that got people to the White House, it's all people who know Native people. A lot of them are Native people. So when you look at who gets invited to some of these events, you're going to see a lot of New Mexicans because there's a lot of New Mexicans who work at the White House. So from that perspective, I wasn't surprised that to see somebody from my community there, but I was still very happy and very proud to see somebody from my community performing at the White House, which
Tell us
as
more.
far as I know, I mean, I haven't gone back and looked. I don't think anybody from my tribe has ever performed at an event like that.
Tell us more about your tribe and where you grew up. Give us
Yeah,
some.
so I'm from Okeawinge. It's a small tribe in northern New Mexico. We're one of the tribes that we use our historic name, but if you look on maps, sometimes you'll see it's called San Juan Pueblo or the Pueblo San Juan. We're known for being the location of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And that was when our ancestors rose up against the Spanish government because of historic mistreatment. So through that, we're kind of considered, the center of Pueblo culture, at least among the people who speak our language, which is known as Tewa. So I grew up there. I went to school there. I spent all my years there. I was lucky enough to live next door to my grandmother, and I spent a lot of time with her and having her experiences because she grew up when New Mexico was the name of the state. So to have this kind of cultural background it's very important to me, and even to this day, it really guides me in my efforts.
Talk about the significance of Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. I recall writing an article about her when she was elected to Congress for National Geographic, and spoke to so many people who expressed such a deep sense of pride and just wonder and amazement. And so she was at the event, is that correct?
Yeah, she was the co-host of the event, which is pretty amazing.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, obviously the First Lady was the official host of the event. So when the invites went out, it actually said the first Dr. Joe Biden invites you to the White House. But for her to say, I'm going to give my time and I'm going to give my platform to Deb Haaland, who was the first Native person to be Secretary of the Interior and the first Native person in a presidential cabinet, that shows that Dr. Joe Biden, she actually understands and she knows and she, understands where we're coming from as Native people. So, to see Deb Haaland up there, she's also a Pueblo person. She's from a different tribe than I am, but her tribe is close to my mother's tribe because my mother is from two other tribes that are closer to hers. So to have that kind of person there, it just really is another point of pride, at least for me, because I am a Pueblo person from New Mexico. And, she's historic. I first met her at the Democratic National Convention in 2016. She was the first Native person to be in charge of a state Democratic Party. So from there, just seeing her elevate and seeing her come to the White House, that's an amazing path to happen just from 2016 to 2020, when she became nominated to be Secretary of the Interior. And that's just 5 years. I mean, that's amazing.
Well, so I want to run something by you that I saw a conversation recently about African American first. The first Black woman Supreme Court justice, or the first whatever. And the two people who were sort of doing a point counterpoint, the one said, this is, it's wonderful, it's inspiring, and we should all sort of celebrate it. And the other person said, it just speaks to how many barriers have been placed in our path and how difficult it is. And why are we in the 21st century, so far into it, there's still so many things that we've been locked out of. And when the first happens, we celebrate it, but it says something. So I wonder if there's a similar sentiment in the Indigenous community.
Oh, yeah, definitely. In terms of New Mexico, for example, most Native people weren't allowed to vote until the 50s. And a Pueblo person from the Pueblo Isleta, which is near Albuquerque, had to go to court and prove that not only was he alive, a real person, he could actually vote as an American citizen. And so these are very recent occurrences for us to have somebody not only be in a position of power, but someone to be able to convince other people that they are worthy as well, because we have never had those kinds of opportunities. Obviously, within our own tribes, we've always had leaders. We've always had people who have come to Washington, D.C. to advocate for our tribes, but we've never had somebody within the administration like this who can advocate on that level. And it's the same thing with Congress. Deb Haaland was one of the first two Native women to be elected to Congress, and that wasn't that long ago either. So these are relatively new occurrences for Native people. And it's not just because of the barriers, which there are many. It's just the fact that there just aren't that many of us. So, depending on where you go, sometimes there's almost no Native people. Depending on where you go in parts of the West, there are more. So it really is going to take more time. And we do need people like Deb Haaland to tell others that we're still here and we still exist.
Acquaint us with the mission statement behind Indians.com. Tell us more about the content and what you're seeking to transmit when you produce stories.
Yeah, so historically, Native people have been denied the opportunity to speak. And when you look at newspapers that are based near reservations, it's very racist, it's very discriminatory. These are known as border towns. And so when your local newspaper calls you dirty names and writes stories about your community that are obviously biased, that informs your upbringing and your beliefs. And when you are a minority among other people, that does affect how news is presented about you. So in order to counteract those kind of historic sentiments, we try to give people as much information as possible. Being online is a blessing in that you can link to information. You can actually show people the treaty that you're talking about. You can actually show people the law that you're talking about. You can actually show people where the information comes from directly, which is not as easy to do when you're doing a print version of a news publication. So from that angle, we try to give people as much information as possible. We try to give people historical information, because a lot of these incidences, a lot of these controversies, they're not new. They're rooted in decades of fights, decades of advocacy, decades that have been fought by people who came long before us. So if you show people the historical information, people like to read that because they want to see, well, what have we learned from the past and what can we do to make sure that our voices are heard going forward.
One of the major themes for this group of fellows has been sort of confronting the issue of lived experience and how that's interpreted in newsrooms. Sometimes it's embraced, sometimes it's challenged, sometimes it's second guessed, and people are told maybe they're too close to the issue that they want to cover or to the community that they're interested in. So I wonder if you could just sort of tell us why Indigenous journalist representation in newsrooms would matter, particularly, or there should be more of it, particularly when, again, the gatekeepers are still overwhelmingly white, and communities that they're producing the news in may not have a lot of Indigenous people in those communities.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge issue. I've heard from a lot of journalists, they want to cover these issues that have been overlooked for so long, and they're told exactly what you just said, that it doesn't matter, it's not going to be important to other people who are not from that community, or B, you shouldn't be reporting on it because people think that you might be biased toward them. So that is a huge issue, and that's one of the reasons why we do need more Native people telling their own stories. The very basis of the relationship between tribes and the United States is a nation-to-nation relationship. It's a relationship that's based on the sovereignty of tribes and the sovereignty of the United States. So when we talk about our right to speak up, it's written in the Constitution, and we should be able to voice that right and to express and exercise that right whenever we want. And that's why you'll see a lot of tribal newspapers. Almost every tribe has a newspaper, or at least a newsletter, and that's how they get information out to their community. But we need more independent voices because, as you know, there's a lot of tribal corruption. Tribal politicians are no different than American politicians. They don't like it when you ask questions. They don't like it when you wonder what they're doing or what they're spending the money on, or sometimes even when they're indicted in federal court. So there has to be a really big focus on mainstream media to start focusing on Native people. And then we need to support, independent Native media, and even we need to encourage tribes to say, oh, you have a history, you have a tradition of storytelling within your own community. You should utilize that more. And there are communities that do that, especially during the pandemic. I was really happy to see some of the smaller tribes in New Mexico. They put their youth in front of their videos and they were sharing the news that way. And so it really is, this new generation of people who are saying, well, we have phones, we have more access than we did in the past. We have social media, and we're going to use that to our advantage. And tribes need to really think about that from their own perspective in order to get that information out to their own people.
I want to start opening this up for questions, but so please raise your Zoom hands if you do have a question, but I'm going to jump in with one more. And that is, you mentioned that you noticed during the White House event that there weren't any other major media there covering it. Tell me a little bit about that and what the implications of that are.
Yeah, so that was really the most disappointing part. I've been to the White House many times in the past, and when you go, they tell you what time to show up, and you have to check in at a certain gate, and they tell you to wait in the briefing room. And when you walk into the briefing room for the first time, it's kind of amazing that you're in there, but then you realize this is the tiniest room I've ever seen. When you look at it on TV, when you see the White House press secretary talking to people in there, it looks much bigger on screen. But when you go there, it's such a small room. So when I showed up for this event, which was on a Tuesday, I was the only one there. There was no other media waiting. I thought I would recognize, or I would see a fellow Native journalist that was invited. I thought I would see somebody else there. I was the only one there, and I was concerned. So I called the First Lady's contact and I said, well, I'm here. I want to let you know I'm here. And she said, oh yeah, we'll come and get you. And so to me, being the only person that showed up, that's a problem. And it's a problem to me, at least from the White House side. They could have done more to get Native journalists to show up, but also to get mainstream media to show up. And so when the event finally started, the only other media there was the pool reporter, and the pool reporter filed 2 reports for the whole evening. And to me, that was not in comparison to events that the First Lady has held just days before. One of her prior events, the pool reporter filed 7 pool reports. So it was definitely there was not enough work done by the White House to get Native journalists there to cover the event and to get mainstream media to cover the event, because it was a historic event. This is the first time in history that the White House ever celebrated Native American Heritage Month. And for only 2 media outlets to be there, that's a problem.
Very much so. I don't see any Zoom hands yet, so I'm going to put one of our fellows on the spot here. Mina, are you there?
Hello.
I'd love for you to tell Acee about the coverage that you are planning or want to do in Mississippi that you were talking about with Angel, and perhaps get some feedback from him.
Yeah. Hi. Yes, my name's Mina. I'm with Mississippi Today. I'm the justice reporter here, and I've been trying to expand, the idea of what justice is on my beat, so that it's not really heavy on just the criminal justice system. And one of the topics I've been trying to get a little bit more into is, Native Americans, the tribes, Indigenous issues. And I was trying to do a localized story about the Brackeen versus Holland case that's before the Supreme Court now, and kind of getting the perspective from our tribe here, the Band of Choctaw Indians. And that's kind of my first foray really into any sort of Indigenous reporting. I've really tried to be really mindful going into it, because I know how much historical harm has been done, and like everything that, I could do wrong as an individual with even trying to write the story. So keeping in mind things like framing, like I don't want to, approach this as like, oh, it's about the poor families who couldn't, get to adopt these kids and give them a better life. It's, it's everything that's at stake for the tribe here, and like really anywhere in the country. That's kind of what I was trying to approach it as. But, I'm trying to get into building relationships with our tribe and being able to tell stories and not just showing up, when bad things happen. But that's kind of what I've been working with currently. And hopefully the story should be able to come out next week.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, for those who don't know, they've been a leader in some of our sovereignty fights and economic development initiatives. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians was actually the subject of a 2016 Supreme Court case regarding a Dollar General store manager that did terrible things on their reservations. So it is important to kind of consider those historical backgrounds and some of those historical actions. And the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians was actually, I think, part of the first ICWA case back in the late 70s, or maybe it was early 80s. So that history needs to be told. And if you can tell that in a story, it might take a few stories. I think people really need to hear that, because within Indian country, we all know who they are. Everybody knew Chief Martin, who was their longtime chief, but does anybody else know? So that kind of information, I think, will be valuable.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I definitely wanted to get into the Holyfield case that you just referenced, because when I was doing my research, I'm like, oh, they clearly already have experience with a Supreme Court case specific to ICWA. So I was able to talk with the tribe a little bit about that. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. And where will it be published, the story?
It will be in Mississippi Today. Our website's just mississipitoday.org. It's free for anyone. And yeah, I'll be happy to share it when it does come out.
You also cover entertainment and culture at Indians.com. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, this has been an interesting time for TV and film when it comes to Native people. There's actually Native people on television now, which is something that never happened. So we've been following those kind of developments too.
One of the things that I think about when it comes to inclusion in newsrooms and representation is the fact that there's such a small percentage of people of color movie critics, or people of color food critics, or dining critics, or whatever. What are your thoughts about that as it pertains to the Indigenous journalists?
Oh yeah, we definitely need more of those. And the person who I had mentioned earlier, who lives in Virginia, he's an independent now Native film critic. He does film and television criticism. His name is Vince Schilling. He's Mohawk. He formerly worked with ICT, but now he's running his own shop. So to have that kind of perspective is needed, because as you mentioned, if the people who don't understand the issues are talking about a film or even a book that they don't understand, they're not going to review it in a not even in an educated manner. And this has happened in places like the New York Times review of books. They've had to commission multiple book reviews of a Native author because the first person who did the review didn't get it. And there's one thing with not liking something, and then it's another issue if you don't understand it, period. And when you have people who are reviewing books or looking at TV shows or films who don't understand it to begin with, that's obviously a big hurdle.
Let's talk about the image of it, the Indigenous image in TV, movies, etc. I know that there is the one show, is it on FX? But it's about a group of young Indigenous people, and it follows their. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's Reservation Dogs.
Yes,
tell
us.
On Hulu.
Well, tell us about whether or not we're moving in a positive direction as a society in these representations or these offerings, or not. What is your opinion?
Well, the fact that not only did we have that show on television, we also had Rutherford Falls, which was on Peacock. Although Rutherford Falls is only had 2 seasons and it hasn't been renewed. The fact that we had those 2 shows, and then another show called Resident Alien, which had a large number of Native people both behind the camera and in front of the camera. The fact that they were there alone, it speaks a lot to the fact that we are moving a little bit forward. Because whenever you look at the representation reports that have been done in the past, they all say 0 for Native roles, 0, and some years there'll be 1, and then you look up the role and it wasn't even portrayed by a Native person. They couldn't even find a Native actor. So the fact that there's Native people who are actually writing these episodes, producing these film and television projects, and starring in them, that is a huge step forward, and we've never had that recently. And in addition to those TV projects, there was a very popular film also on Hulu called Prey, which is part of the Predator franchise. And that was also a largely Native starred production. So these are things that have never really happened before. And so when you contrast that with what the New York Times covers, instead they cover Yellowstone, which is produced by non-natives. And then they recently did 2 features on Yellowstone, and they profiled one of the actors who isn't native, and then they did a roundtable with average Americans, and in that roundtable there was only one person of color in there, and it was a woman, and then they had another person of color in the panel, but everybody else was white. So when you kind of wonder, well, why is the New York Times focusing on a television show made by non-natives, but now they're asking about native issues? You got to wonder, where that perspective is coming from.
We have a question from one of our fellows. Amanda, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Acee. Thanks for joining us. My name is Amanda. I cover energy and the environment in New Hampshire. My tribe is actually in Wisconsin, the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I was just really curious. I think about this sometimes in my career, and I mostly grew up off the reservation in Vermont, and there was very little representation of Indigenous people. So when I became a journalist, I definitely wanted to elevate that in my coverage, and I've been lucky to be able to do that. But I'm curious how you think about yourself as a journalist being in DC, obviously contributing really important coverage of sort of national issues. But do you feel we just heard from another journalist from Muskogee Nation, and she works there in the reservation. So I'm curious if that's been something you've thought about in your career, just the difference of being at home in your home community versus being in DC, and how you kind of think about that, if that's a tension for you, or if you feel it isn't. And yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference. And one of the things that I tell people is, when you're going to cover a tribe, you shouldn't just show up randomly. I mean, there should be a reason you're going there. If you're not sure about going to a particular place, you should ask them first. And I know that's different from, another community. Sometimes, we can just show up and knock on their doors and bother them. But when you're going to some of these smaller reservations, especially those, out west or in rural areas, I think you should ask first. So that definitely is something to consider. And so if I were to work at home, it'd be a different story. I would probably want to write about, little things and funny things and hilarious things that I see. And so that does influence the type of coverage. The times that I have written about home, it's because, like people who came to the White House, they were from my home community. And that's just, to me, it's important that people know that. So there is a big difference from reporting from your own community and then being somewhere else. So I would encourage, people to do both. There's a way you could do both, I think.
Let's pivot to online presence, our online footprint as journalists of color. And I have to share with the fellows that when we asked Acee for a headshot to include in the program and on our website, he sent the absolutely most adorable photo of himself. Boy, I just thought, how precious is this? But you had a good reason for doing that. And we've talked a little bit about sort of online harassment over the past 9 months as well. Acee told me that it's because he's been the victim of doxing. So can you tell us a little bit more about your experience in that regard?
Well, I think everybody knows that Twitter is one of the worst places anybody can be online. And right now it's terrible for journalists to be on Twitter. We just saw Elon Musk ban journalists simply because they posted a link that he didn't like. And so when you look at some of these platforms, but Twitter in particular, you're going to find people who are very interested in what you're covering, but they also have very strong views about what you're covering. And it's different from other platforms. You don't see the same kind of vitriol that you see on Twitter, on Facebook. You don't see it on Instagram. You see different types of commentary and discourse, but it's not the same as Twitter. So, if you identify yourself as a journalist on Twitter, people are going to attack you, and they're going to question you. Sometimes they'll just put your name in their tweets, or sometimes they'll just message you and they want to tell you something, or who knows what they want to say. So I don't know what the training is now for people to address that, but there needs to be at least something going on there, especially when Twitter's run by a person who's willing to ban journalists for apparently no reason.
What's the most difficult interaction you've had with someone online? Can you share?
Well, I wouldn't say anything's been particularly difficult, but what is interesting is that when people don't like what you write, they basically focus on you as an individual. And that's not really always the solution. And if that's all people are focused on, then they're not going to read the news in the first place. And so you want to sometimes brush it off and say, well, they're not the type of person that I'm writing for anyway, but they're still out there. So you do have to recognize that there are people who are very invested in certain issues, and they're going to get really mad if you write about it.
So you have 51,000 followers on Twitter. What's the way forward now? Are you doing what some other people are doing, and that's jumping platforms and maybe going to Mastodon or whatever else is out there?
I tried Mastodon, and I don't think anybody knows what's going on over there. It's just very bizarre. I don't know what's going to happen to Twitter. I don't think people keep saying it's going to die, but I don't think it's going to die. I think it's going to be there. And I mean, I wouldn't trust Elon Musk to really do anything different than what he's already been doing it's barely been a month maybe that he's been in charge. So I don't think I haven't talked with my coworkers about if we're going to do anything in regard to Twitter. But I did see that just yesterday or the day before, Mark Trahant, who was one of the godfathers of Indian journalism, he quit Twitter. He deactivated his account. He said no more. So there are journalists who are valuable sources of information who are leaving because they see that it's not a great place to be.
Laura, you said you think Post is the move. I've never heard of that. So tell me a little bit.
Oh my goodness. Well, okay. So they're all bad. I don't really know anything about any of them. Hi, I'm Laura Duclos. I'm now an audience editor at MediaWise, which is part of Pointer. I actually work with Gabby. So I should know. So basically the idea is that a lot of journalists are going over to Post right now, but it's like a very glitchy, like it's not really an app. It's very in beta mode. You have to waitlist it. Like MediaWise is waitlisted right now, but I'm in somehow. I don't really know. But apparently like their funders are sketchy. So I don't know why or how, but apparently that. And then Mastodon is also just like, it's extremely hard to navigate. I say we bring back MySpace, but that's it. I'm sorry. I don't have any useful. My brain is like goo because it's the end of the year, but I wish I had something more valuable to contribute. I'm so sorry.
I can join in. Hey, I'm Gabby.
I'm like,
no, it's fine. I work with Laura. I'm a PolitiFact reporter, so we cover all the misinformation. So we had an entire conversation about Twitter this morning because, oh my God. And I haven't tried Mastodon yet either. I'm a little scared of trying it based off of what everyone had said, but I might not have a choice in a minute. I don't know. But I would agree and definitely just want to echo what you said, Acee, about Twitter and how things can quickly just blow up just simply because people don't like you, just because they don't like something you wrote, and so they will attack you. And that's been a huge issue that I have faced in my almost 2 years here at PolitiFact. So that I definitely resonated with that. I mean, if you have any other tips to share on how you've navigated it and also tips of self-care when that kind of thing happens, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And unfortunately, the people who are attacked the most are women journalists, and they face the worst of it. And, the way that I dealt with it, and it only arose in the summer of 2020. And, I had to think, well, who are the people that are trying to post information about me, and where are they coming from? And when I looked at it from that perspective, I realized, oh, well, it's not that important. And that's how I viewed it. I didn't think it was that important for me to respond. It wasn't that important for me to really invest that much into it. But that doesn't mean it's not harmful and that it's not coming from a place of negativity, which I feel a lot of it is. I mean, why would anybody waste that time looking into you if they didn't really have a negative view of you? And I want to say, oh, you don't believe anything these people write because of something that I found about them in the past, or whatever you want to, whatever the issue is. So I would say, what I've done more recently, because of the Elon Musk takeover, I just don't look at Twitter anymore. I've decided that, there's no reason to look at it. I know there's people, but my coworker does. So he kind of curates the most interesting things. So if that would be my advice, we should just stop looking at it. But I don't know what's going to happen next month. I mean, who's Elon Musk going to ban next month? I don't know.
Or we write to all the billionaires and have them contribute their piggy, the change they find in their couches, and buy Twitter from him. I think that's the way to go. Laura, you have
Sorry. Yeah, I actually do have some. I feel so bad for being so useless. I do have something useful. So one thing that I am noting, well, obviously everybody's going over to TikTok, and I'm focusing a lot more of my time on TikTok. Unfortunately, Gabby, I'm right there with you. People, it sucks whenever it's your face representing facts and people don't like facts. That's always a really, really tough one. My solution was that I told my manager I can no longer moderate comments that involve me in the video, because I just it sets me back really far. But an interesting one, so like TikTok Live, but one I'm seeing kind of creeping up really slowly is actually Twitch. And I know Twitch has been around for a long, long time, but I feel like it's being used in a new way these days. And I feel like I'm seeing a lot of journalism stuff go that way. And I'm even one of my tasks next year is to pursue media-wise stuff on other platforms. And Twitch is one of those big things that they're really considering. So maybe that's where we go as journalists. I don't really know.
Acee, does Indians.com engage with TikTok? Do you have any content?
We started a TikTok account, but there's hardly anything there. So the video is just not one of our focuses. Indian Country Today, now known as ICT, they're really strong on videos. So I always tell people, when you're looking for a video about Indian news and Native people, look at ICT in the US or APTN in Canada, because APTN is an actual television station that's run by Native people. So video, I don't think, is something that will ever be on the forefront for Indians.com, simply because it's just not our strong point, and I don't know if it ever will be. But I love TikTok. There's so many hilarious Native people on there, and to get to see people filming from their backyards, and to see people posting from their own communities and posting the little quirks about their own communities, that's so great to see, because a lot of it we can understand. When you come from a small place and you come from a place that is remote, you can really relate to a lot of the content that a lot of these Native people are posting. But I haven't been to Twitch yet, so I'm going to look that up.
Are there any other questions before I hog the scene here and wind this up?
I just asked, excuse me, I'm Daisy. My question for you was, if I know that video is not your strong point, but do you have any favorite Native accounts or creators that you follow, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram or any other outlets other than your own, that you look to for Native content?
Well, for news, definitely ICT and APTN. And APTN is short for Aboriginal People's Television Network. Those are the really news outlets that do great things with video. And as far as content creators, the person I really like is Naomi Glasses. She's on Instagram and TikTok. I don't have her handle, immediately in my head, but her name is Naomi Glasses, and she's a skateboarder from the Navajo Nation. She's just hilarious, and she does great work too. And the thing about TikTok is once you start liking, one Native person, it shows you every other Native person. And so a lot of the people, I wish I could tell you their names, so I'll have to come up with a list of that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So let me start to wind this down by asking you a very central question, and it's certainly essential to why this fellowship was created. And that is the lament that's often heard in newsrooms that we just can't find any talented Black people. We just can't find any journalists of color to cover politics or whatever. So clearly, Indigenous journalists are included in that lament. And so what would you say to someone who sat across from you and said, it's impossible to be inclusive because we can't find anybody? What advice would you offer them?
Well, I think it is difficult to say, oh, if I want to find a person who comes from a traditional journalism or media background, because if you look at Native people, they're not seeking out those careers in the first place. But when you look at it from our cultural perspective, we all have a tradition within our communities of telling our stories and being the sharers of information. And that's who these mainstream outlets should be turning to, is to people from the communities who understand their history and their culture, and they're able to share it from that perspective. You don't need to have a degree in it. You have to just say, these are my stories and these are the stories of my people. And that's where mainstream media should look. If they continue to try to say, oh, we're only going to look to the right pipeline, to the right people, who went to the right schools, they're never going to succeed. And they need to realize that's not the way that they need to look at it when it comes to Native people.
You're active in NAJA, is that correct? And if you are, what are some of the plans for that organization in the coming years?
Well, I am a member of the Native American Journalists Association, but I'm not involved in any other activities. I'm a member because I think we should all be members of the Native American Journalists Association. So I wish I could tell you what they're up to, but I don't know.
Based on what you've just said about collecting stories and looking to content that is based on these very rich stories of different tribes, I think you and I, and as I told you yesterday, I hope to have lunch with Polly and Jordan in the new year. So all of us need to get together and think about ways to create a pathway, to put the word out and to have people like you mentor young people and perhaps present journalism as a potential career. But in the interim, let me ask for your final words. What would your words of advice be to these young early career journalists about sticking it out and being here 10 years from now?
Oh yeah, definitely. It takes a lot of tenacity, and you're going to get people who don't want to talk to you and don't want to listen to you. And that could be for any subject, but it is more difficult when you cover Native American issues. So you do have to take a lot more time to understand the people that you're talking to, because they're very wary of mainstream media coverage for a good reason. So you do have to spend a lot more time. You do have to really cultivate those relationships. But also, I would encourage people to take an Indian law class. If you're on a campus or near a campus that has a law school, and if they have an Indian law class, take that, and that'll give you a really good understanding of some of the issues that Native people face. And when you tell people, oh, I know about this case, I know about that case, they actually know that you're serious, and they know that you're not just covering it because you got the assignment. They know that you're interested in it. So having this historical understanding of where Native people come from, that's going to be helpful for any journalists. And I tell that to even mainstream people that I meet. I say, you need to know more about Indian law. I mean, and that's what I would recommend, is find an Indian law class, maybe online if you can't find one near you, just to understand some of these historical perspectives.
Great advice from Acee Agoyo of Indians.com. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to warn you that we're going to be staying in touch with you. We're going to have you work with this program and other programs within NPF where we can benefit from your experience and your wisdom and your advice. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.